It's not always rainbows and puppy dogs when it comes to real estate. Today we're talking about the downside to real estate, so stick around.
Welcome to the Infinite Wealth Podcast, where we teach clients how to build wealth and create passive income without the risk of Wall Street.
Welcome to the Infinite Wealth Podcast. I'm Cameron Christensen, along with our co-host Anthony Faso. And today we are going to be fair. We spend a lot of time talking about the pros of real estate, and today we're going to be talking about some of the cons, Anthony, so the good and the bad.
I'm still trying to digest the rainbows and puppy dogs. You caught me off guard there.
Yeah.
Good one.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. So, guys, today we're talking about the good and we're talking about the bad of real estate. We've got 7 or 8, I think, bullet points here that we're going to discuss with you guys. Anthony, you got anything to share before we dive in?
Yeah, this started from, I would say that we have a vast variety of clients, but most of them they're either experienced real estate investors or investors, right? Not all real estate. But then we have a lot of people that are kind of new to the game, right? Maybe they just read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, right? And this is kind of their first exposure to passive income, and they're not so sure about real estate. And I had talked to one of those clients, and she's like, you know what? You guys talk a lot about real estate, about how great it is, but you don't talk about some of the not so great stuff, which, to be honest, I feel like we take a lot of pride in our content, particularly about IBC, where we've had many episodes of, 3 reasons not to do IBC, or, 6 reasons why, the downsides of IBC. And I think we do a good job explaining the good and bad about IBC, but we haven't yet done that about real estate investing.
Yeah.
So I thought that this would be a great opportunity. And with real estate, it's a very broad asset class, right? Because we could be flipping houses, or there's short-term rentals, mid-term rentals, long-term rentals. I mean, there's multifamily, so there's a wide variety. For the most part, what we're going to be focusing on is more of the long-term rental. So a long-term is typically meaning a lease is about around a year, and sometimes even more.
And with that being said, is that, guys, we do have a cash flow matrix, right? So this one, we're talking about long-term rentals, but if you guys are out there and you're looking for opportunities, again, we've organized some of the opportunities that we've discussed on our podcast, and we have it down to 20-something different categories or opportunities that you can look at based upon the amount of money that's required, amount of time and energy that's going to be required, the time frame in which you should look to be invested in it, your expected returns. And so if you guys have questions about that, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to walk through that with you, and maybe even share it with you. We'll see. So,
all right, Cam. So let's dive into it. What's the first kind of downside, or what's the opposite of a rainbow and puppy dog? I don't know, but explain what the first topic or the first downside we're going to discuss about real estate.
Yeah, the first downside to real estate obviously is that it's illiquid. And what that means is that it's not easily transferred into cash, right? And so when you go and you buy a long-term rental, you're usually putting down 20%, 25%, maybe these days, as a down payment. And when you make that does go to the principal of the value of the property. But it's very illiquid, meaning it's difficult to tap into. And so that right there is probably one of the single greatest downsides there is to real estate. So you own a house, great, but if there's any equity in there, it's very difficult to access. So 2 easy solutions that I would point out. Number 1 is you got to have reserves. Right, is you do absolutely have to have a reserve fund anytime you're owning property. So that's kind of a dedicated account, or at least dedicated funds that are sitting there in reserve, if, I want to say in case, but when something goes wrong with that property, that you have access to. And then the second one is you can create a HELOC. So home equity line of credit, right, is something that you can open on a property, which is going to a bank and asking them to give you a loan against the value of that house. Typically, they'll give you 80% or something there. So you can open up that HELOC. You can have access to it. Doesn't mean you need to use it, but at least have it open just in case something goes sideways and you have to tap into that. So 2 easy things that you can do. 1 is have reserves. 2, have a HELOC on your personal residence or investment property. Nice.
Well done, Cam.
Thanks, man. All right, Anthony. Option number 2. What's downside to real estate?
You know, when you hear somebody talk about real estate, they talk about the cash flow, appreciation, depreciation, and ability to leverage and the tax advantages of it, which are there's many great tax advantages of it. Particularly, we have the ability to depreciate the value of the home, right? So maybe we're only putting 20% down, but we have the ability to depreciate 100% of the entire home. Now, there are limits. We need to spread some of that out, but typically, particularly in the beginning of the real estate, we're going to show losses, and part of that's going to be our mortgage. Those first few years, I mean, most of it is going to interest, which is a deductible expense, but also we can depreciate the value of that home. So that's what I call a non-cash expense, meaning we can deduct it, but it's not coming directly out of our pocket. So thus, typically, we're going to show a loss in the first many years of buying the real estate. The problem is what people don't often talk about is those losses can be limited. And in essence, I'm going to try to summarize things for tax purposes. When your investment income or from businesses are really in 2 categories: active income and passive income. And what determines that, for the most part, is really how active you are in that business or investment, or are you very passive? Now, the reason for those distinction is there's limits when we have passive losses. And by default, this is by the IRS, income from real estate is automatically passive. So those passive losses, the downside of having passive losses, we can only deduct those against passive income. So many clients, when they're starting out, particularly maybe they already have their W-2 job, right? And they're trying to get out of it, but those losses you may not be able to deduct in that current year. So thus, those tax benefits from real estate you may not be able to enjoy in the first couple of years. Now, some solutions around that, because here's what's interesting, and we've talked about this before: the government will create a problem, right? And then they will create exceptions to solve that problem. So here's another prime example. That they made that the exception that you can't deduct passive losses, but again, they created an exception around it. The biggest way to avoid that is what's called a real estate professional. And by the IRS standards, I'm not going to get too much in the detail, but in summary, about half of your time needs to be somewhere involved in the arena of real estate. So if you're a realtor, you would qualify, but it can be a little difficult if you have a full-time job to justify that half of your time is invested in real estate. Well, what if you have a spouse who doesn't work or only works part-time? What we could do is we could have him or her be considered a real estate tax professional, and thus you're filing a joint return that will allow you to deduct those passive losses in those current year. And a little story. This is a story of a client who's actually planning to use this exact strategy. And what it is, both spouses work, and they're in the highest tax bracket. And surprisingly, he wants to quit his job, right? And he wants to be able to spend more time with the kids and also be able to spend more time in his real estate investing. And what's happening is he has these losses, but he's not able to deduct them. So what he's been doing, and again, he was working with a CPA, which again is another reason that CPAs don't have to be liabilities or expenses. If you get a good one, they're actually an asset and can provide some sound advice. And he was working with Lloyd, who's we've had on the podcast many times, but they had worked together and said, well, look, if you were to quit your job, then you can be considered a real estate professional, and then you can allow you to take these deductions, and then you can deduct them against your wife's W-2. And so when he's looking at what he needs to do to quit his job, he doesn't need to replace his income. He needs to replace his net income, right? Because his taxes are going to go down by his ability that he can offset probably around $50,000 to $75,000 of his wife's tax bill. So that alone, what that will do is that will allow him to be able to quit his job sooner. Another a way around this solution is we just create some passive income. Now, there's a few ways to do that. If you have multiple businesses, maybe there's a way that you could justify that one of them is passive. So you have that, you could use that passive income to allow you to take those passive losses. Or also, there's some syndications or some investments that are really designed specifically to create passive income so people can deduct their passive losses against that. In fact, we even had we've had one on our podcast where the syndication, they bought ATM machines, and they would pay a monthly cash flow, but that's considered passive. That's passive income. So thus that would allow you to deduct those losses. And then another solution is you're not going to lose these deductions. You're just going to carry them forward until either you have taxable or passive income or you sell the property. Now, when you sell that property, all these losses you have been carrying forward can be deducted in that single year. Now, just a little side tax strategy. If you were to do that, if we may have an additional 100 or maybe 200,000 of losses, means that's the time that where maybe that's when it's time to tap into your 401k, where either worst case, you convert your traditional IRA to a Roth, and then that taxable income, you can offset that with those passive losses, or even better yet, that's when we take the money out of our 401k, free that money, then let's buy more real estate, which will allow us to create even more tax deductions. Okay, Cam, that was a little long-winded one, but it was super important.
You started talking, I fell asleep. Thanks for that slap. You woke me up.
I know. I'm going to watch the video back to see your eyes. Now, what's the next downside of investing in real estate?
Absolutely. Number 3, the third downside to real estate investing is most people believe they're looking for short-term goals or short-term rewards. And that, I would say, is a mistake. When you're looking at real estate, you got to be looking at it long-term, especially long-term rentals. One of the reasons that they call them long-term rentals is for that reason right there. I don't know if that's true, Anthony, but it sounded really good.
Yeah, I think it is true.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. All right. So long-term rentals, right, are there to help you build long-term wealth. I can't tell you the number of people that kind of approach us and actually come to us a little disappointed, right? Maybe they've bought the first property or two and they're like, hey, I just put $25,000 down and I got $200 a month in cash flow. Like what, that's not going to move the needle. That's not changing anything for me. And so the solution there is just changing your mindset and changing your vision and your approach to the reason as to why you're doing that, right? What I would tell you is long-term rentals are not a game changer in the short term, but they're absolutely a game changer in the long term, right? Long term, you've got these things working in your favor. Number one, if you look at some of the economic situations in which we're right now, number one being inflation, right? Long-term real estate or long-term rentals are a great hedge against inflation. You've got rent control, and then the tax advantages that Anthony just talked about is we've got depreciation, and then we also have appreciation on that property. So this is downsides, right? I just gave a list of the good, right? Right. But again, right, that is one thing that I would say is that is one of the shortcomings, especially in the long-term space, is that shortcoming on the cash flow. If you guys look at that opportunity and are not happy, you got to find different alternatives. You got to find different investments that are going to satisfy some of those short-term opportunities or some of those short-term needs. And so, again, that's why we have that cash flow matrix, if you guys want to talk to us about that. But one thing I would tell you is if you're in this real estate space, there's two opportunities that I see a lot, and I see two opportunities that people are very successful here. Number one is going to be wholesaling, and then number two is going to be flipping. Right, is I've seen a lot of guys be very successful in the short term by wholesaling and flipping those properties and coming into the kind of those bigger chunks of cash and capital much quicker than just kind of sacking it away. So there is absolutely kind of a path that you can go down as you're building real estate via the wealth, or building wealth via real estate. And again, long-term rentals are more of a long-term play for you. So make sure you guys get clarity on what you're trying to achieve. And I think that'll help with your vision as well.
Cam, I really like how you had mentioned we need to change the mindset, because part of, just in the example that you had said, people are focusing, they're focusing on the cash flow, which is an important piece, but we need to open up our mind to realize there's other things going on. For example, I'm kind of rounding some numbers here, but I have a property that I paid about $100,000 for. Okay, and I think it's cash flowing maybe $3,000 to $4,000 a year, which doesn't sound like a lot, right? But we also have to look at if it appreciated 2%, then that means that $100,000 that it'll be worth 102. So I have $2,000 in equity of appreciation. Also, the tenant is paying down my mortgage. And on this particular one, we're paying down, even in the year 1 and 2, about $2,000 of principal. So thus, I've got $4,000 in cash flow, but I also have $4,000 in the equity. So we need to open up our mind and really be looking at the big picture.
Great point. Thanks for sharing, Anthony. Point number 4. What is the fourth downside to real estate?
When you own real estate, you're taking on an additional level of additional liability. If somebody were to get injured on your property, who do you think they're going to sue?
The owner.
Everybody and anybody, and whoever's name is on the deed is going to is subject to that lawsuit. Okay, but there's a few solutions here. A simple one is just increase your liability insurance. Okay, but also you could put your property inside an LLC. And then by doing that, any lawsuits cannot go outside the LLC, meaning they can't come after your house or your business, only what is inside the LLC. And if you wanted to take it a step further, there's an asset protection trust. Now, I would imagine probably 90% of people listening to this podcast should at least have a living trust. That living trust avoids probate when you pass, but it does not provide asset protection. There's some additional trusts that do provide that. And I will tell you on a personal story, I knew I needed to put my properties in an LLC. Just got lazy. I mean, and part of it is I didn't know how to do it because it's from out of state and I didn't have a contact over there. So I just continued to put it off. But then I got an email with some repairs and some pictures, and that property, there was a repair bill to fix 8 bullet holes in my property.
Anthony's in the hood.
And then at that point, I'm like, man, it's time for me to really take care of business. So I went and I called the attorney that I've been talking to before, and I'm like, hey, Rob, it's time for us to pull the trigger.
Yeah.
We need to set up this asset protection trust. And what this does is after 2 years, anything inside the trust is protected from lawsuits. So my house is going to be in there, my businesses, and my real estate. And to make it even more inclusive, we started an LLC for the property. And since I have multiple properties, in theory, you may need multiple LLCs. But depending in some states, what we did is we set up what's called a series LLC. So we have one LLC, which owns all the properties, but we're able to kind of divide them into series, which is kind of like a separate LLC without having to pay the annual fees and the setup fees. Now, on that note, I don't know when this is going to drop, but I think the following week after this drops, we're interviewing the attorney who set up my asset protection trust. So that's additional liability that you don't have typically when some other investments. Mm-hmm. But Cameron, what's the next downside of owning long-term real estate?
The next downside to owning long-term real estate is actually dealing with tenants, right? Someone has got to deal with tenants, termites, and toilets. And here's your solution is outsource that at all cost. If I can't tell you the number of times I've spoken with clients and individuals that have tried to self-manage, it never goes well. There is an instant level of frustration that becomes apparent, right, as soon as you bring that up. And so my advice to you guys is, number one, is always approach this as a business.
Yeah, good
right?
point.
Approach it as a business. Make sure you outsource that piece, the property management piece. Yes, you're going to pay for it. It's going to come out of your cash flow on a monthly basis, but it's the best money that you're ever going to spend. Outsource that at all cost. Do not self-manage. The only thing that you're doing by doing that is creating an additional job for yourself. If you're approaching this as a wealth creation piece, is you can outsource that for what is relatively a very small amount in the grand scheme of things, and you'll be much, much happier.
That's a good point. I like how you're mentioning being happier, because it's going to take the emotion out of it. I guarantee you, if I was managing that property and I got the call that there was bullet holes and I went down there and saw it, I would have been emotionally attached. Mm-hmm. This is my house. And I would have been felt a level of being violated.
Yeah.
Right. But you want to know what? That it got fixed before I even saw the pictures.
Yeah.
So it was able to emotionally detach myself from the investment.
When I talk to clients and they call in and we ask them about kind of what they have, their holdings and stuff, and as soon as they answer the question, right, as far as like what they have and everything else, I can almost instantaneously tell if it's self-managed or if it's outsourced, right? Just because of the way that they bring it up and the way their voice changes is self-managed, very short, very kind of angry, right? But man, if they've got it outsourced, they've got it just approaching as a business, much, much happier in the long run. I promise you that. All right, number 6, Anthony. Tell our listeners what the 6th downside to real estate is.
Is that there will be future expenses. Now, we have a house. Just like the house you live in, there's going to be some minor repairs. Mm-hmm. You know, a light goes out or water pump needs to be replaced, something minor.
Bullet hole shows up.
Yeah, bullet holes show up. Eventually there will be some major repairs, or we call them capital improvements. I mean, eventually you're going to need to redo the carpeting. You're going to need to repaint the property. The AC unit will eventually go out. Mm. So there's going to be these future expenses, and also you're going to have some vacancies.
Yeah.
And hopefully it's minimal, but there's going to be a time where you don't have that rent coming in. So the solution to that is twofold. For one, when we're analyzing the deal, we need to anticipate these future expenses. And what typically the norm is that we allocate between 5 and 10% of the rent to repairs, to capital improvements, and vacancies. So those are each three separate, meaning we're either allocating about 15% to 30% of that monthly rent for future expenses. We need to, when we're evaluating this as a good deal or not, we need to anticipate those future expenses. And I would tell you the way that I've calculated that, well, twofold. Bigger Pockets, which you've probably heard of, is a great resource for real estate. Mm-hmm. They have different levels of membership. You used to be able, they have a great calculator where you can anticipate these future expenses, and even does projections out, we're taking into account the debt pay down and also the appreciation. But I think now you have to have a paid membership in order to calculate those. Then I ended up just creating my own spreadsheet, right? But we need to evaluate those future expenses, but then also we need to have some money in reserves. You talked about that at the beginning. These real estate properties are great in the long run, but in the short run, we're going to have some cash flow issues. So we need to have some money in reserves to anticipate for those future expenses.
Great point. I'm glad you brought it back up. I'll add this as you're talking about calculators and Bigger Pockets, great resource, but another great resource, Aaron Chapman, Security National Mortgage. We've used him. He's got some great calculators out there, and one of them is a reserve calculator, right? A reserve fund calculator. And I believe it's free. He's got an app, but he's also got a link on the website. If you guys have questions, go out there, check it out, look around. And what I found out there from looking at his and then a couple other calculators is that reserve fund is typically about $4,000 to $5,000 per $100,000 that you have outstanding in loans. Mm-hmm. So you have $100,000 outstanding, you should have about $4,000 to $5,000 in a reserve fund, kind of sitting there just for those future expenses.
Which, if you were to follow that, you're going to have a pretty hefty reserve fund. Mm-hmm. I wonder where you could store that money that would be liquid, right? It's going to grow at a decent return, maybe ideally tax-free, maybe some level of asset protection. Maybe one day we'll get something like that. Yeah.
All right, so we just gave you the top 6, and Anthony, I know you've been kind of holding one in your back pocket. You saved the best for last. I'm going to tee it up for you, man.
Okay, do it.
Yeah. Number 7, downside to real estate. Anthony, share that with our listeners here.
I think this might be one of the biggest, not only cons, but maybe an obstacle into somebody getting involved with real estate. And what I mean by that, odds are your friends and family probably not investing in real estate, right? And they're probably telling you horror stories.
Yeah, the guys that are self-managing.
Yeah, exactly, right? But here's the solution. We need to focus on facts, not opinions, right? And I was at fault of that for many years, particularly here in Las Vegas through 2008. All I heard were horror stories, right? And in part, and you mentioned they were self-managed. Also, a lot of times when they were buying these properties in Vegas, they were focused or relying on the appreciation, not the cash flow. Oftentimes they would buy a property, it wouldn't cash flow $200. It was a negative cash flow $200. So all it takes is somebody not to pay the rent, and you're going to be in arrears very fast. And then it was difficult to get them evicted. And I had heard stories of people coming in and trashing the house. So now you had all these repairs. So hearing all those horror stories or those opinions of what people were sharing, I stayed away from real estate. And now looking back, man, do you know how much I missed on depreciation since, even if we would have bought it before 2008. But I would tell you that's why I've been trying to focus on looking at the facts and not opinions, but also maybe it's time to upgrade your inner circle. Mm-hmm. Right. And we had talked about this on a couple of podcasts ago, is that Ed Milet had shared, you can't out earn your inner circle. Right. And I've often heard that your salary is the average of the 5 people that you hang around with. So, and I had a client I spoke to the other day, excited to get into real estate. She's actually looking more at the short term, but nobody she knows is doing it. And she's looking for, some people to kind of help with that journey.
Looking for a community.
Yeah, looking for a community. So there are communities out there. I mean, Bigger Pockets has one. We will be having a community. So there will be a place for people, because I'm sure there's many of you might be saying the same thing about IBC. Like, nobody I know is practicing infinite banking. I feel like I'm on an island. Well, we are working to create our own island together. Also, there's real estate and investment meetups. Mm-hmm. Whether you look at Meetup or start looking around and you want to hang around people of like-minded people. They may be able to share some wisdom, or maybe share some opportunities as well.
Well said. Well said. Anthony, I think I figured out what the opposite of rainbows and puppy dogs is.
What's that?
It's thunderclouds and old cranky cats, right? So that's kind of what we're talking about today, is some of the thunderclouds and old cranky cats, right? Today what we talked about was 7 downsides to real estate. Here they are briefly. Number 1 is lack of liquidity, illiquid asset. They may not qualify for all the tax benefits. You got to change your vision from short-term emphasis to making sure that we're looking at long-term. Also, you will bring on some additional liability. You got to make sure you're doing some proper planning to address that. And then dealing with tenants, we're going to outsource that at all costs. Future expenses, hey, it just is what it is, right? You buy property, there's going to be expense that's going to come out of nowhere, so you better be ready. And then the last one is, if you go down this road and start building wealth this way, you are going to be doing something different than everybody else, and you need to be comfortable not listening to everybody else's opinions, and stay the course and put yourself in a community with other like-minded individuals. Really hope you guys enjoy this episode, and go make it a fantastic day.
Take care. If you like this video, I know you're like this one. And if you want to learn how investors use infinite banking to increase their returns and lower their taxes, check this out. And if you have some questions and want to see if infinite banking is for you, hop on a discovery call with us. Link for that will be in the description.